The dust of the street was a fine, hot powder that clung to her bare feet, a second skin of shame. It coated the frayed hem of her dress, a garment the color of dishwater, stretched thin across her hips and shoulders. She stood on the raw lumber of the auction block, not for livestock, but for herself. The rope bit into her wrists, a rough, hairy thing that had chafed the skin to an angry red. Her name, whatever it had been, was lost. A thing discarded with her shoes and her dignity somewhere on the trail that led to this sun-beaten Dakota town. Here, she was only the woman, the large woman, the burden. A man named Silas, whose face was a pinched map of displeasure, stood beside the block. He was the one who had brought her here, her intended, a man who had seen her for the first time that morning and found her wanting. His voice was a thin, reedy instrument of complaint. "Look at her," he said to the small, grimy crowd of prospectors and tired farmers. "I was promised a helpmeet, a wife. I sent good money for passage. And this is what they send me." A few men snickered. A woman in a gray bonnet pulled her child closer, her lips a tight, disapproving line. "She's built more for hauling than for housekeeping," Silas whined, gesturing at her broad shoulders. "Eats more than a draft horse, I'd wager. I won't have her, but my money's spent. Someone can take her off my hands. Settle my debt at the general store, and she's yours." She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the wooden platform beneath her. She had learned long ago that meeting their gazes only invited more cruelty. She made herself a stone, a heavy, unmovable thing. If she could not be invisible, she could at least be inanimate. The murmurs of the crowd washed over her. Words like sturdy and hefty meant as insults, landing like pebbles against her stony silence. The sun beat down, turning the sweat on her brow to a salty paste. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. No one wanted another mouth to feed, especially one they judged to be so large. Silas was growing desperate, his face turning a blotchy red under the brim of his hat. He was about to speak again, to lower his price, to add to her humiliation. But then a shadow fell across the block. He had been standing at the edge of the sparse crowd, near the mouth of an alleyway, half hidden by the overhang of a roof. He was a Lakota man, tall and lean, his face a landscape of quiet endurance carved by sun and wind. His black hair was braided, his clothes were worn buckskin, practical and without ornament. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a stillness that seemed to absorb the town's ugly noise without being touched by it. He moved forward. The crowd parted for him, a mixture of fear and grudging respect in their shifting feet. He did not look at them. His gaze went straight to her, and for the first time it was not a look of assessment or disgust. It was just a look, quiet, deep. He saw the raw skin on her wrists, the tremble she could not hide in her hands. He stopped before the block. His eyes met Silas's. "I will take her," he said. His voice was low and steady, a sound like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. It was not a question or a bargain. It was a statement. Silas blinked, momentarily flustered. "You? What would you want with?" He trailed off, looking at the man's unyielding face. Greed wrestled with his prejudice and won. "The debt," Silas said, recovering his swagger. $30 at the mercantile." The Lakota man reached into a pouch at his belt. He did not count out coins. He produced a small, heavy collection of finely trapped pelts, beaver, mink, their fur rich and dark. He dropped the bundle at Silas's feet. It was worth far more than $30, and everyone there knew it. The value of it hung in the air, a silent rebuke. Silas stared at the furs, his mouth agape. "But what for?" Silas stammered, his eyes darting between the pelts and the woman. "You need a field hand." The man's dark eyes moved from Silas and settled on her again. He looked at her not as a burden, not as an object of scorn, but as a person. And then he spoke the words that changed the air, that silenced the crowd, that cracked the stone she had built around herself. "She will be my wife," he said. The words were not said with passion or romance. They were a shield, a declaration of status that lifted her from property to person. A name, a place, a protection. He stepped onto the platform. He did not touch her. He pulled a knife from his belt, its blade worn and sharp. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the rope that bound her wrists. The fibers parted and the pressure fell away. She rubbed her raw skin, her hands trembling. She still did not look up. He stepped back down and waited. He did not command her. He did not pull her. He simply stood, offering a path away from the block. After a long moment, a silence that felt as vast as the plains, she took a slow, deliberate step. Then another. She walked off the platform, her bare feet meeting the dusty ground, and stood a respectful distance behind him. She was free, but she was following. He turned and walked away from the center of town, not looking back to see if she was there. He knew she would be. She had nowhere else to go. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts as they left the murmuring crowd and the pile of rich pelts in their wake. The journey to his home was a long walk into silence. The sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through dry grass and the crunch of their own footsteps. He walked ahead, his pace steady and unhurried, never so fast that she could not keep up. He did not speak. She followed, her world shrunk to the sight of his back, the worn leather of his moccasins, and the vast, unending sky. The land was harsh and beautiful, a canvas of golds and browns under a sun that bleached the color from everything. The wind was a constant companion, pulling at her thin dress and whipping loose strands of her hair across her face. It felt cleaner than the air in town, scrubbed of judgment. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its peak and began its slow descent. Her feet, already sore, began to ache with a deep, burning pain. She stumbled on a loose rock, catching herself with a gasp. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood for a moment, listening to the plains, before his shoulders relaxed and he looked back at her. His eyes flickered down to her bare feet, red and dusty, then met her gaze. He walked back, unslung a water canteen from his shoulder, and held it out to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. The metal was cool against her hands. She drank, the water tasting of earth and life, and it was the first true kindness she had received in months. She handed it back, her throat too tight with unspoken gratitude to form a word. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting instant. The touch was nothing, a ghost of contact, but it sent a tremor through her. He nodded once, a small, clipped motion, and resumed walking, his pace a little slower than before. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and purple across the horizon. His home was not a house but a small, sturdy cabin built of weathered logs, chinked with mud and time. It stood alone on a gentle rise, overlooking a creek that snaked through the tall grass. A single cottonwood tree stood sentinel beside it. The place did not look welcoming. It looked enduring, like it had braced itself against 1,000 storms and was ready for 1,000 more. Near the cabin, under the cottonwood, was a small, neat mound of stones.
Agrave.
A few hardy wildflowers, struggling against the wind, grew at its base. She understood, then, the source of the winter in his eyes. This was a place of loss. He pushed open the cabin door, which swung inward with a low groan. He stepped aside, holding it for her. It was a gesture of civility she had forgotten existed. She ducked under the low frame and entered. The inside was one room, spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A narrow bed with a folded blanket sat in one corner. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. There were shelves holding a few clay pots, some dried herbs, and a small stack of books. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else. Emptiness. Profound, hollow silence. He followed her in, letting the door fall shut. The last of the light filtered through a single small window. He moved to the fireplace, striking a flint and steel. Sparks flew, caught in the tinder, and a small flame flickered to life, pushing back the encroaching shadows. He did not tell her what to do. He went about his routine as if he were still alone. He added wood to the fire, filled a pot with water from a bucket by the door, and set it on a hook over the flames. She stood uncertainly by the door, a stranger in a strange house, her presence a disruption to the quiet grief that lived there. He seemed to sense her hesitation. He looked over at her, his face illuminated by the growing firelight. He gestured with his chin toward a pile of soft furs and a spare blanket in the corner farthest from his own bed. "You can sleep there," he said. The words were simple, practical. "No one will lock the door." That promise, more than the offer of a place to sleep, settled something deep inside her. No one will lock the door. She would not be a prisoner. She nodded, a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying washing over her. He turned back to the fire, taking a small sack from a shelf. He measured out some cornmeal into the bubbling water, stirring it with a wooden spoon. He was making them dinner. An unspoken contract was being drawn in the firelight. There would be food, there would be shelter, there would be safety. And for now, that was more than enough. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They lived in a shared space but moved in parallel orbits, their lives overlapping only at the edges. A world of unspoken understanding was built, not with words, but with work. She rose with the first gray light, long before he did. She found a broom made of bound twigs and swept the cabin's plank floor, the soft whisking sound a gentle counterpoint to the sleeping silence. She learned the path to the creek, the way the cold water felt against her skin as she filled the buckets. She tended the small, struggling garden behind the cabin, her hands finding a forgotten comfort in the soil. He would rise and nod to her, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, of the swept floor, of the full water buckets. He would go out to check his trap lines or hunt, disappearing into the vastness of the plains for hours. He always returned with something. A rabbit, a brace of grouse, or just the scent of sage and distance on his clothes. She learned to cook on his fire, to make the corn mush less lumpy, to roast the meat until it was tender. One day he brought back a sack of flour from a trading post miles away. She spent the afternoon kneading dough, her hands remembering the motions from a life before. The loaf she baked was misshapen and a little burnt on the bottom, but the smell of it filled the cabin, chasing out some of the emptiness. He came in that evening, stopped, and inhaled deeply. He looked at the loaf cooling on the table. He said nothing, but when they ate, he took a piece, tore it, and used it to mop up the juices from his plate. He ate every last crumb. She began to care for the place as if it were her own. She mended the threadbare blanket with twine she found in a box. She washed their few clothes in the creek and spread them on the bushes to dry, the fabric snapping in the constant wind. One afternoon, she gathered a small handful of purple wildflowers from the prairie and walked to the mound of stones beneath the cottonwood tree. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder in his grief. But the grave looked so lonely. She carefully tucked the flowers between the stones, a small offering to the woman who had been here before her. When he returned, he saw the flowers. He stopped his horse yards away and just looked at the grave for a long time. He didn't say anything to her about it, not then, not ever. But that evening, as a chill wind began to blow, he came in and quietly draped a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders while she was stirring the pot over the fire. It was his. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and pine and the open air. The warmth of it sank into her bones. The weight of it felt like a shield. Their silences were different now. They were no longer the empty, awkward silences of strangers. They were comfortable, companionable. They would sit by the fire after their meal, he mending a strap of leather, she patching a tear in his shirt. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames, the whisper of the wind outside, and the small noises of their tasks. One evening, the wind turned mean, howling around the corners of the cabin and rattling the door in its frame. A storm was coming. She felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Storms reminded her of other things, of being locked in a root cellar, the sound of thunder indistinguishable from the sound of angry fists on the door. She must have made a small noise, a catch in her breath. He looked up from the arrow he was fletching. His dark eyes were questioning. "You are safe here," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the rising howl of the wind. It was a simple statement, but it landed in the core of her. It was a promise he had made before, but this time it felt different. It was not just about the lock on the door. It was about him. He was her safety. Later that night, the fear came for her in her sleep, a nightmare vivid and suffocating. The jeering faces of the crowd, Silas's whining voice, the bite of the rope. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright on her pallet of furs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. In the dim light, she saw him. He was sitting up on his own bed, watching her. Not with alarm, but with a deep, patient quiet. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He just sat there, a silent guardian in the dark, letting her know she was not alone. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her breathing ragged. The dream clung to her like wet paper. She could still feel the phantom burn of the rope on her wrists. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness. The word was a tiny thing, almost lost to the dying fire. It was the first question she had ever asked him. He was silent for a long moment. The embers popped, a spark briefly illuminating his still face. "My wife," he began, his voice low and rough with memory. Her name was Anpetu, Morning Star. She was small, like a bird. A fever took her in a single winter. The town doctor would not come. He said it was too far, the snow too deep. He paused, the silence in the room heavy with what he did not say. "I saw them looking at you. I saw their faces. I would not let another be left to the mercy of such men." He was not talking about love or desire or even companionship. He was talking about honor, about correcting an old and bitter wrong. He was stitching his past to her present with a thread of raw decency. She looked down at her hands, broad and capable in the firelight, the hands they had mocked. She thought of the wildflowers on Anpetu's grave, of the bread she had baked, of the way the cabin was slowly starting to feel less empty. They were two broken people, finding a way to piece together a life from the shards of what they had lost. "I will not run," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. It was a vow. He gave a single, slow nod in the darkness. He lay back down, and soon the steady rhythm of his breathing filled the small space. She lay down too, but not to sleep. She listened to the sound of his breath and the fading wind, and for the first time since she could remember, she did not feel afraid of the dark. The house, his house, breathed around her, and for the first time it breathed with her. The slow thaw of their shared existence was measured in small, quiet changes. He started leaving a piece of wood and tinder set up in the hearth each morning, so it was easier for her to start the fire. She started humming while she worked, quiet, half-forgotten tunes that no longer felt dangerous to let out. One afternoon, she was trying to fix a loose board on the porch step, wrestling with a hammer that was too heavy and nails that were bent. He came back from the creek, stopped, and watched her frustration for a moment. He came over, wordlessly took the hammer from her hand, and with 3 clean, efficient strokes, drove the nail home. He then held the hammer out to her, handle first. "Keep your eye on the nail," he said, his voice neutral. "Not on your thumb." She took it, her cheeks warm. A faint, almost imperceptible crinkle appeared at the corners of his eyes. It was the closest she had ever seen him come to a smile. The community they had left behind did not entirely forget them. Occasionally, a rider from the distant settlement would pass by, the man slowing his horse to stare at the cabin, at her working in the garden. She could feel their judgment from 100 yards away. The Lakota man and the big white woman he'd bought. One day, a neighbor from a homestead 5 miles down the creek rode up, a man named Peterson, with watery blue eyes and a nervous tick in his cheek. He stopped his horse at a cautious distance. Chayton, whose name she had learned from hearing him whisper it to his horse, came out onto the porch and stood, waiting. "Jedediah," Peterson called out, not dismounting. "Just thought you should know. Silas has been talking. In town. Says he was cheated. Says he's coming to get his property back." Chayton's posture did not change. He remained perfectly still, a part of the landscape. "She is not his property," he said, his voice carrying easily on the wind. "Well, that ain't how he sees it," Peterson said, twitching. "He's gathered a few men, drifters, says the law is on his side. That a bargain is a bargain and you changed the terms after the fact. Claiming her as a wife. It complicated things for him. Made him a laughingstock." Chayton looked past Peterson, his eyes scanning the empty horizon as if he could already see them coming. "Thank you for the warning," he said. It was a dismissal. Peterson, looking relieved to have delivered his message, nodded curtly and rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust. She had been standing just inside the doorway, listening. The old fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. Property. The word was a brand. Chayton turned and looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes. "Go inside," he said. It was not a command, but a protection. But she did not move. She thought of the shawl he had given her, the way he'd fixed the step, the quiet space he gave her every single day. She thought of the name Anpetu and the lonely grave. This place, this fragile piece, was hers now, too. She had swept its floors and tended its garden. She had a stake in it. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. He held her gaze for a long moment. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his own. He did not argue. He simply nodded and went back into the cabin. He returned a moment later with his rifle, checking the action with practiced, efficient movements. He did not look at her again, but he knew she was still there, a silent partner in the watch. They waited together as the sun began to dip low, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and violent red. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. They did not have to wait long. Just before sunset, they appeared. 3 riders on the horizon, dark shapes against the blazing sky, moving with the lazy arrogance of men who believe they have the right of way. Chayton stood on the porch, rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He was a statue of calm resistance. She stood just behind him, near the doorframe, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had armed herself with the only thing she could find, the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It was cold and solid in her sweaty grip. The riders reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin. Silas was in the lead, his face puffed with righteous anger. The 2 men with him were lean and hungry-looking, their eyes darting around, taking in the small cabin, the lone man, the woman half hidden in the shadows of the doorway. "I've come for what's mine, Jedediah," Silas called out, his voice thin and strained. He refused to use the man's real name. It was another small, deliberate insult. "Her name is not Jedediah," Chayton said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried with the weight of stone. "And there is nothing here that belongs to you. I paid her passage." Silas screeched, his composure cracking already. "I made a deal in town, a debt settlement. You took her under false pretenses. You can't just take a man's property and call it a marriage." "I gave you fair value," Chayton replied, his gaze unwavering. "The deal was for the debt. The debt is paid. What I do with my wife is my concern." The word hung in the air again. Wife. He had used it in town as a shield for her. Now he used it as a weapon against Silas. Silas's face contorted in a sneer. He looked past Chayton directly at her. "Her. Look at her, hiding behind him. She's nothing but a cow. Come on now, girl. Your master is here. Stop this foolishness." Something inside her, something that had been dormant for years, finally broke. It was not fear. It was rage. A pure, clean fire that burned away the last of her submission. She stepped out of the shadows of the doorway and into the dying light, the iron poker held tight in her hand. She did not say a word. She just met Silas's gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. Silas faltered, surprised by her sudden defiance. He had expected a cowering, passive creature. "You see," Chayton said, his voice soft. "She has made her choice. I have a bill of sale." Silas lied, gesturing vaguely. "She's mine by law." One of his hired men shifted, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. In a movement so swift it was almost a blur, Chayton raised the rifle. He didn't point it at Silas, but at the ground just in front of his horse's feet. He didn't have to fire. The simple, fluid motion was a promise of deadly intent. The drifter's hand froze. "There is no law out here but what a man can defend," Chayton said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "This is my land. She is my wife. You will leave now, or you will be buried on it." The raw, indisputable certainty in his voice was absolute. There was no bluff, no bravado. It was a statement of fact. The two hired men exchanged a nervous glance. This was not the easy reclamation they had been paid for. They were looking at a man defending his home, a man who had nothing left to lose and had already buried a part of his soul on this very ground. Silas looked from Chayton's unyielding face to the woman's furious glare, to the rifle that had not wavered an inch. He saw no fear. He saw a wall. He was a man of bluster and complaint, not of blood. His courage, thin as it was, evaporated under the weight of their combined resolve. He tugged violently at his reins, his face a mask of thwarted fury. "This isn't over," he spat, the words hollow and meaningless. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it back the way he had come, his two companions scrambling to follow, leaving nothing behind but the settling dust and a profound, ringing silence. Chayton stood there for a long time, rifle still ready, watching until their shapes were swallowed by the twilight. Only then did he lower the weapon, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. He turned to look at her. His eyes found the iron poker still clutched in her white-knuckled hand. He looked at her face, streaked with dust and defiance. "You did not run," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of awe. "You did not let them take me," she answered, her voice trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. He took a step closer, into the circle of her personal space for the first time. He gently reached out and took the heavy poker from her hand, his fingers closing over hers for a brief, warm moment. He set it down on the porch. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a responsibility or a memory of a past hurt, but as the woman who stood beside him. "I was scared," she admitted, the words a raw whisper. "I know," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He did not touch her again, but he did not move away. They stood together on the porch of the small, weathered cabin, wrapped in the quiet of the plains as the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The house was no longer his or hers. It was theirs. In the days that followed the confrontation, the last of the ice between them melted away. The stand they had made together had forged a new kind of bond, one tested by fire and found strong. The silence in the cabin was no longer just comfortable. It was intimate, a shared language of glances, small smiles, and quiet, synchronized work. One evening, they sat by the fire, the meal finished, the cabin warm against the cool night air. She was mending one of his shirts, the familiar weight of the fabric in her lap a comfort. He was watching the flames, his face thoughtful. "You should have a name," he said, his voice pulling her from her work. She looked up, surprised. She had been without one for so long. She had almost forgotten what it was like to be called something, to be seen as an individual. The woman was a label, not an identity. "I had one," she said quietly. "I don't remember it much anymore. It belonged to a different person." He nodded, understanding. "A new name, then, for the person you are now." He looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. "I would call you Lena." Lena. The name felt soft on her tongue, simple and strong. Felt right, felt like her. A tear she didn't know was there slid down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming release. It was the first tear she had shed in his presence. "Lena," she repeated, tasting the sound of it. "I like it." He gave her a small, solemn nod, as if officiating a ceremony. "Lena," he said again, and the way he said it, it was both a gift and a promise. In that moment, she was no longer the discarded innocent, the nameless burden. She was Lena. The next day, he went to the ashes of the small fire Silas's men had tried to set at the edge of his property, a petty act of spite as they fled. It had fizzled out in the damp grass, but it had left a black, ugly scar on the land. He spent the morning clearing the charred earth and rebuilding the section of broken fence nearby. She came out and helped, handing him tools, holding the posts steady while he secured them. They worked together, not speaking, restoring what had been threatened. It was a symbolic act, a quiet declaration that they were here to stay, to build, to heal the land and themselves. That night, he made a formal declaration. "In the eyes of my people," he said, his voice low and formal as they sat across the small table. "A man who shares his home, his food, and his protection with a woman, and calls her his wife before others, is married to her. The stand we took, that was our ceremony. Before this land, before our spirits. You are my wife, Lena. If you will have me as your husband." It was not a proposal born of passion in the way the stories told it. It was quieter, deeper, a recognition of a truth that had already grown between them. It was a partnership forged in hardship, a love built not on pretty words, but on shared burdens and unwavering support. She looked at him. Chayton, her protector, her partner, her husband. The man who had seen her value when no one else had. The man who had given her safety and then a home and then a name. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will." The final image of their old life went up in smoke a week later. She took the stained, gray dress she had arrived in, the one she wore on the auction block, and she fed it to the fire. She watched the flames consume the fabric, turning the symbol of her humiliation into nothing but heat and light and rising ash. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And something new was a life, a future. They sat on the porch in the evenings now, side by side in the 2 wooden chairs, watching the sun set over their land. The cabin no longer felt empty. It breathed with their shared life. Sometimes he would reach over and take her hand, his rough, calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. They didn't need to talk. Everything that mattered had already been said in actions, in loyalty, in the simple, profound fact of their being there together, 2 solitary souls who had found their other half in the vast, quiet wilderness. The house was a home, the land was a sanctuary, and the 2 of them, against all odds, were a family. This story, it ain't just about a rescue. It's about how sometimes the deepest healing doesn't come from being saved, but from finding the courage to save someone else. It's about how 2 people, broken by the world in different ways, can fit their shattered pieces together to make something whole, something stronger than either of them were alone. Chayton didn't just offer her a shield, he offered her a mirror. In defending her honor, he reclaimed his own. In giving her a name, he remembered who he was. And Lena, she didn't just find a safe harbor. She found her own strength. She learned that her worth was not measured by the cruelty of a crowd or the size of her waist, but by the resilience of her spirit and the depth of her heart. She learned that a home isn't just 4 walls and a roof, but the space where you can finally, safely, be yourself. So here's the naming of it. We all have parts of ourselves that have been judged, discarded, or left by the side of the road. We all have our own silent griefs, our own lonely cabins of the heart. The world can be a harsh and unforgiving place, quick to label and quick to abandon. But this story tells us that kindness is a quiet thing, a practical thing. It's a canteen of water on a long road. It's a shared blanket against the cold. It's standing firm against the loud voices of hate and declaring, simply and without fanfare, "This one is mine to protect." It's a reminder that true strength isn't about the noise you make, but about the ground you refuse to give. And if you're brave enough to offer that quiet kindness, if you're strong enough to stand for someone when no one else will, You might just find that the person you end up saving is yourself. You might just find that in the heart of the wilderness you can build a home.